When I was younger, I was studying to be a priest. You know, in Catholicism, like your religious life, there's levels to that. So in order for you to be really committed, then that means you have to be like a priest or, you know, a monk or something like that. My going to study to be a priest, it was part of my commitment for a greater spiritual journey, but also it was a pursuit of what's true. You know, Muslims in Philly, they had a massive impact. So that question of why do you believe in Jesus? You know, Jesus is a man. You're saying that this man is God. It forced me to kind of go deeper into my religion. I wasn't just going to drop it. So I went through a process of kind of working things out through Christianity first. And I was looking at all the other religions. And the only thing that's really left is Islam.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
By this time, I had left studying to be a priest. And then eventually I left Catholicism. And I was in my college dorm. And I was like, you know, what do I do now?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Tell the people your name and where you're from.
My name is Yusuf Rios, originally from Philadelphia, Puerto Rico.
What was your experience like growing up?
I'm a 80s baby, so I saw massive changes take place, especially within the inner city. You know, and I'm from that middle generation between the 60s, 70s, and the 90s. So there was a lot of social change. You know, I was one of those children that lived through the war on drugs. So I seen the people change. And also, you know, I was one of those that had that experience of Philadelphia that was very into calling people to Islam. Not necessarily arguing about Islam, but calling people to Islam. So I got to experience that. So it was a pretty good experience.
Did you always believe in God?
Yeah, I came from a pretty religious background. My father's side was Protestant Pentecostal. My mother's side was Catholic.
How did you first hear about Islam?
Islam, you know, there's always a question that, you know, you get asked as a person that comes into Islam. And the more that I study it, I see that it was like a very long process. You know, there was drops, you know, of exposure to Islam from an early age. I can remember seeing things about Islam as a young person. And then I started to pursue understanding Islam because I wanted to know who Jesus was. So that took me like to Palestine and so on and so forth. You know, I was trying to figure out who Jesus was actually. Then there was the experience of what was Islam, you know, in the environment, which was like the Philadelphia environment was pretty heavy with the Muslim presence. You had, you know, Hajis on the bus and, you know, with their little canes and very proud of going to Hajj. And then you had the people having their incense tables and you had brothers talking about Islam. Then you had whatever it was that was in the music, you know, at that time. So there was different points of exposure.
So what part of it attracted you to it?
The reality of Islam as a lived way of life, like it wasn't just, you know, in the church type of concept. It was like a lifestyle. That was one of the major flipping points that flipped me from Christianity to Islam. You know, and especially in Catholicism, they have a real big division. Like your religious life, there's levels to that. So in order for you to be really committed, then that means you have to be like a priest or, you know, a monk or something like that. Where as a Muslim, on the everyday, you have a commitment to Islam.
Tell me the moment when you realized Islam was the truth.
I think the moment that I realized that was when I was younger, I was studying to be a priest. So I went through a process of kind of working things out through Christianity first. And I was looking at all the other religions and I was like, the only thing that's really left is Islam. And I was really good with the idea of who God is at the basic level. My only real issue was who the Prophet Muhammad was. For me, you know, it was like, is this guy the Dajjal? You know, because in Christianity, you're taught that Jesus is the last and the seal and all that type of stuff, and nobody's coming after him except the Antichrist. So I was still stuck on that piece. But at that point, I realized, like, you know, Islam in Aqidah, this is it. So for me, it wasn't a full process. It's like I had to go through stages. By this time, I had left studying to be a priest, and then eventually I left Catholicism, and I was in my college dorm. And I was like, you know, what do I do now? I want to be religious, but I don't have any commitment to this anymore.
So can you tell me why you left Catholicism?
Firstly, my going to study to be a priest, it was part of my commitment for a greater spiritual journey, but also it was a pursuit of what's true. You know, the Muslims in Philly, they had a massive impact. So that question of why do you believe in Jesus? You know, Jesus is a man. You're saying that this man is God. It forced me to kind of go deeper into my religion. I wasn't just going to drop it because brothers on the street or on the corner were, you know, saying this is not the truth. So that's what pushed me to kind of look further. And at the same time, I was already practicing. I had my own journey with Christianity, but the doubts and the questions made me look further. So that was a big issue for me to figure out, was this true or not? And I left to study to be a priest with that commitment. It's like, if this is not the truth, if this is the truth, then I'm going to veer in this direction. And I spent like 2.5 years on that, formally studying. Well, even before that, I was searching out, to see where I was at with Islam. There was always this strange relationship.
You mentioned that you wanted to study Islam to learn more about Jesus. How did that influence you on your decision to come into Islam?
To be more accurate, what it pushed me to do was look at Palestine, because Jesus was attributed as being from that land and so on and so forth. And so trying to understand who Jesus was as a human, it's not easy. There's no authentic biographies. It's a lot of imagination. I'm not saying that it's not things that you can't benefit from, but it's not accurate historically. It's not something that's documented, authentically transmitted, isn't scientifically verifiable, anthropologically accurate. All of that type of stuff is missing. So looking at Palestine, where the Muslims were, gave me the opportunity to kind of think through the whole question of who Jesus is. The reality of the situation is that the more that you look at, especially Palestine, you see that Jesus, first of all, he lived very similar. What was known as Palestinian culture, especially you talk about being a shepherd, living off the land. So the more that I looked, the more that I realized Islam has something to say about who Jesus is. And Jesus is fundamentally a part of Islam. You know what I'm saying? Islam does not deny Jesus' existence. As a matter of fact, it gives Jesus and his mother a huge role in the Quran. So that was major. I think that's important for Christians in general to know. And we as Muslims, we failed on that part, to really present that common ground between ourselves and the Christians, where when you look at the companions or the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, one of the things that they did when they went to Ethiopia is they immediately started talking about that common ground. I think that they will benefit a lot if we as Muslims, we just explain that point. Not even from an angle of trying to convert people, but from an angle of sharing what the truth is. Let them, come to that judgment, on their own.
What do most Christians misunderstand about Jesus?
I think that one of the biggest things is his connection to the way of life that Moses has set out. The other issue is the fact that Jesus, and even in their own scholarship, this is backed up, that Jesus worshiped one God. The Trinity confuses that, whereas their scholarship of the last 300 years have said that no, there's no authentic evidence to say that Jesus said he was God. So the Christians miss that point. The other thing that they miss is that Jesus is part of a continuum of other prophets that are teaching the same thing, that God is one. That's what's in, one of the first things that you find in the 10 Commandments is the what we call the Shahada, what the Jews call the Shema. Hear ye, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. They miss all of those points. And so when you look at Jesus, he's bringing these realities. The other thing is that Jesus on the ground, he was walking with the poor. He was reforming the practice of those who claim to be the followers of Moses. They miss that point completely. But I think that the essential piece that they miss out on is that Jesus was teaching the same religion as Moses. And Moses took the children of Israel to the desert for years, decades, to teach them the oneness of God. So how can, at the end of all of that struggle that Moses is having with the children of Israel, how can Jesus turn around and flip it and say, well, me as a human, I'm God? That's something that I think that is overlooked. Also, just the Quranic story of the virgin birth, they missed that point, that's in the Quran as well. Those are things that have to be brought out. I think the more that we do that, the more that it will help converts come into Islam better, easier transition. But I also think that it will help their families find some sort of common ground, or have some language that they can use to explain to their family, like, I'm not totally denying Jesus. I'm just denying this aspect, or at least give them some room, to make it easier.
When did you take a Shahada, and how was that experience?
It's been over like maybe 25 years now. My experience was really odd, man. It was a really odd experience. Firstly, I ended up taking Shahada in the Midwest. So I was going between the Midwest and Philadelphia, because I was studying in the Midwest. I remember I was like reading books, and then I came to this point where I was like, maybe I need to go further with this. And at that time, I was calling the masajid. And some of the masajid, they had these phone, you remember those quarter phone booths? There was one of the masjids, Masjid Nord in Cleveland had that. And I was talking to one of the brothers and he was coaching me. And eventually this brother, he even taught me Al-Fatiha. He was coaching me, but I still wasn't 100%. So I opted to go to another masjid, another neighborhood, because I was like, I was outside my zone completely. I was in another city. I was in Cleveland. And when I get there, I encountered layers of rudeness. The first time was like I was in the stores where the Muslims were at, and it's very abrasive. Then when I went to the masjid, I encountered this guy telling me like, what are you doing here? You know what I'm saying? It wasn't even welcoming. And so then they made me wait, to take my Shahada. And one of the brothers, he was a convert. He was Muslim for a very long time. But it was more me. You know what I'm saying? But if I would have went with that flow that they had or that environment or the treatment, it was very rude. You understand what I'm saying? It wasn't very welcoming. So that was my first encounter with the Muslims at that level, which was very different than my encounter with the Muslims in Philadelphia at that time. Philadelphia, Jersey, actually. It was more inviting, like, brother, why don't you learn? Why don't you study this? It was more of like an initiation to like some sort of brotherhood. But what I was encountering was rude behavior, rude behavior. But, I stuck with it, ended up taking my Shahada. I remember it was one sheikh, his name was from Bangladesh, Muzammil. He was with a brother African-American brother from Tabligh Jamaat. He was their Amir. They're sitting debating about whether I should take ghusl or not in the masjid. So I said, look, man, I came in here. I came in here with ghusl already. I'm not going to take ghusl in the masjid. You know what I'm saying? But that's the type of stuff that I had encountered.
After you became a Muslim, what made you want to pursue knowledge?
When I came into Islam, I already had some religious training and background. My early youth, I struggled a lot. In my early youth, I went through a lot of phases, especially I was in the street for a little while in my early youth. But I think due to my family background, I had something to fall back on, which a lot of people didn't have that, background to fall back on. So by the time I hit my late teens, I was already in that process, of kind of like changing myself, working on myself. So by the time I reached Islam to take Shahada, it was based on like a knowledge experience. You know what I'm saying? It was more of a knowledge-based experience than it was like just emotional. So when I took Shahada, I had some understanding about what Islam was about, and it was just kind of a transition more than anything. I felt like it was like a coming home too, like it felt more natural.
How did your life change after becoming a Muslim?
Piggybacking off of the question on knowledge, I came into Islam with some understanding. And there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of different groups. And I came in a strange time. I came in pre 9/11, and I came in when the immigrant community was just kind of began to establish itself. There were no masajid in the suburbs, so everybody still was coming through the city. MSA was still in that phase where they were transitioning. ISNA was like a big, organization that people were looking at. And so that confusion, it pushed me into wanting to understand Islam. There was too much confusion about what Islam is, who's right, who's not right, all of that type of experience.
What was your biggest challenge after becoming a Muslim?
To be honest with you, it was dealing with the different groups. Like it was dealing with the different groups and then recognizing that Muslims had social problems. I came in with this idea that Muslims were, crispy clean and, you know what I'm saying? Like that was my mindset. Like, Muslims are on a whole nother level. So then when I started to realize, no, there's social problems, there's issues going on. Like when I realized that there was like a lot of confusion amongst the Muslims, that was the big challenge. Then I learned to separate, where the Muslims were at and where Islam is at and where the knowledge base is at. I had to learn how to separate, between those different realms. Remember, I converted from another religion. I was still young as well. And as a convert, going through these processes and people are, basically not necessarily attacking, but everybody's trying to get their hands on shaping you. You know what I'm saying? That was the challenge. But once I realized that there were other dimensions to Islam, the challenge started to become easier because then I had a reference point. Remember, this is the time period where the internet is still not, established. The internet was becoming, a point of reference. This is a time period where we're waiting on phone calls for the moon sighting. And people say, I heard a brother say this about Islam. And so it's different, much different experience than people have today. But books were beginning to be released. People were going to go study. You know what I'm saying? There was a lot of sacrifice being made. So that's why I said that I lived in a transition, period. Life was a lot different back then.
How did your family and friends react to your conversion?
I got cut off from my family, a solid 15 years or something like that. So that was another set of challenges. And so the Muslims became family in many ways. I live with that reality up to now, so it's like my relationship to the Muslim community is a lot more emotional because of that break, within the families. Friends, it wasn't, it was kind of like an adjustment. And to be honest with you, I had already cut off my friend base because I had left to the Midwest. So the people more that I was dealing with was, classmates. Everybody was like, what's going on here? So people were just trying to figure out like where I was coming from.
What would you say your favorite thing about Islam?
The favorite thing about Islam is the reality of the authenticity of the Quran, clarity, was fundamental. Islam is about practice and knowledge, and it's not just theoretical, but it can be understood, it can be implemented. So the ability of us to understand it and put it into our lives, that's a big deal for me.
What's your favorite thing about Allah?
Favorite thing about Allah is that Allah comes through. Allah comes through. That one of the things that in my experience as a Muslim, there's been many situations where you're just in a hole and then you turn around and it's just, everything just changes almost, from night to day. You know what I'm saying? So I think that reality of having your dua answered, I think a lot of us have had those experiences. Sometimes we overlook them. Somehow, some way it comes through. Your relationship is not a third party. It's between you and Allah.
What's one of your favorite hadith or verses in the Quran?
The verse that hits me a lot is don't despair of the mercy of Allah. That taqnatu min rahmatillah. That's an important fallback ayah. Don't despair, from the mercy of Allah.
Why should other people learn about Islam or consider becoming a Muslim?
People in general should understand that, there's a significant amount of people on the earth that are Muslim. So to be ignorant about Islam is to be ignorant, about reality, what people are practicing and so on and so forth. As far as people coming into Islam, they should give themselves the opportunity to understand a lifestyle that's going to allow them to have balance between making it happen in the world, materialism and spirituality. At the same time, having a family, Islam gives us that opportunity to renew ourselves, especially in this country right now. This is exactly, not only in this country, but also the West in general. Like a lot of us, we take for granted, we can just come to a masjid, go to any masjid and we plug in. We're able to combat our loneliness. We may have some weird ways of doing it. Sometimes we like to go back and forth with each other. But in general, we have that sense of community where that's just one benefit of becoming a Muslim. The other thing is a lack of clarity about what life is. So Islam gives us some foundation in that. So people should give themselves that opportunity. And not to mention that, we can boast of having a book that has been unchanged for 1400 years. Nobody on the face of the earth, no religion can claim that. That's a major thing. And we know who the Prophet Muhammad was. Peace be upon him. Nobody can claim to know their prophet the way that we can claim. Those are big issues. So I think people should give Islam a chance in that regard.
If you could ask Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam anything, what would it be?
If I can ask the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam something, is like how to navigate the current the world that we live in right now. That's, I think, the major challenge.
Okay, this is the scenario. It's the Day of Judgment. What would you hope your meeting with Allah would be like?
Just one of mercy, one of mercy, realizing that, we're dependent on Allah's mercy to get in.